For 58 years, I lived a quiet, ordinary life as a schoolteacher, until a single phone call changed everything. Out of nowhere, I was told I had inherited millions from a man I had never met, and with it came warnings, secrets, and a mystery that would turn my world upside down. In this story, I reveal how one unexpected inheritance pulled me into a web of deception, danger, and family secrets that I never imagined. Watch till the end to experience every twist and turn that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Don't forget to comment where you're watching from, like, and subscribe for more suspenseful true story dramas. I was 58 years old when that strange call broke the routine of my quiet, worn-down life, a life stitched together by lesson plans, overdue bills, and evenings spent marking papers under the dim yellow glow of the kitchen lamp, and as I pressed the phone tighter to my ear, hearing the man repeat my name with a careful softness, I felt something inside me shift, like the air around me had thickened with a truth I wasn't ready to face, because no one ever called me that gently unless they wanted something from me, and no one ever offered me anything except more responsibility, more exhaustion, more disappointment. Yet there he was, saying I had been named the sole beneficiary of a $5 million estate belonging to a man named Jonathan Hale, a name that meant absolutely nothing to me, though as he spoke, I couldn't ignore the faint tremor in his voice, a trembling that suggested fear, or guilt, or maybe the weight of a secret far older than the moment we were sharing, and I swear I felt my heartbeat stumble when he added that the inheritance had conditions he wasn't permitted to discuss over the phone, conditions he insisted would change my past as much as my future. Leaving me gripping the counter to steady myself because something about his warning felt less like information and more like a threat wrapped in politeness. And before I could ask anything, he told me he wasn't sure I was safe where I was and then promptly hung up, leaving me staring into the silence of my kitchen as if the walls themselves were waiting for me to realize what danger I had just been pulled into. The next morning, I walked into my classroom feeling as though the air itself had shifted, like the walls were watching me more closely, the chalk dust hanging in sunbeams looking somehow heavier, as if aware that my life had just been rewritten by an invisible hand. And while I guided my students through fractions and grammar, my mind replayed every word of the call, the faint lilt of anxiety in that stranger's voice, the way he insisted I must be careful, and a creeping thought wormed its way into my consciousness. What if someone was already following me, already aware that my fortune was no longer merely a rumor or a dream, but real and tangible? And that same thought turned my stomach into ice, because I had spent decades walking through the world unseen, careful not to attract attention, only to have a fortune thrown into my lap like a blazing spotlight, exposing me to forces I couldn't yet name. And as the students laughed at a joke I barely heard, I felt the weight of every penny of this inheritance pressing against my chest, reminding me that life had never offered a gift without demanding a price, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the first real test of my courage was about to arrive before the day was even half over. By mid-afternoon, I found myself walking along the crowded streets after school, clutching my coat tighter as if shielding the secret that now burned inside me, and I passed familiar corners and familiar faces that never truly saw me. Teachers gossiping about petty scandals, shopkeepers exchanging pleasantries, neighbors shuffling along their mundane errands, and yet, I felt eyes on me that weren't there before, felt a presence that pressed against the small, trembling space of my reality, and with each step, I questioned whether I was ready for this wealth, this power, because it had arrived not as a reward but as a challenge, a puzzle I could barely begin to solve. And when I reached the small park where I often sat to catch my breath after grading, I noticed a man in a dark coat, leaning against the lamppost just beyond the fountain, scribbling in a notebook, his head turning ever so slightly whenever I shifted my gaze, and something about him screamed familiarity, though I had never met him before, and a pang of instinctive fear tightened my throat as I realized that my inheritance had already drawn attention I had not sought, attention that might bring danger into the life I had worked so hard to keep ordinary and invisible. And as he disappeared into the crowd, I felt a ripple of certainty that this fortune was a thread tangled with secrets I had not yet uncovered. That night, alone in my modest apartment, I spread out the sparse papers I owned, bills, letters, and the faint ink of my student records, and I imagined a different life, one of unexpected wealth, endless possibilities, and yet, every thought was poisoned by unease, because I knew nothing about the man who had left me this money, Jonathan Hale, and why he would choose a stranger, a poor schoolteacher who had barely scraped by for decades, and as I stared at the ceiling, I began connecting dots that didn't make sense, shadows of memories I hadn't considered, a charity event my school had attended years ago, a man in a dark suit quietly observing me from the back of the auditorium, a faint smile I could not place, and suddenly, the voice from the phone call returned in my mind, cautioning me, warning me, insisting I protect myself, and the room felt smaller, air heavier, as if I was being watched even here, in the solitude of my own home, and when I heard a soft knock at the door, my heart lurched violently, because no one knew I had received this call, and yet, there it was, a shadowed visitor insisting on entering my life in ways I could not yet comprehend. I opened the door to find a lawyer standing there, tall, imposing, with a thick leather briefcase clutched in his hand, and he looked at me with a mixture of seriousness and pity, saying, "Miss Carter, I understand this is unexpected, but you are the sole heir to Jonathan Hale's estate," and as he spoke, I noticed subtle tremors in his voice, as though he was both revealing and hiding something simultaneously, and when he handed me the envelope containing the legal documents, my hands shook. Because it contained far more than mere bank statements, it contained a handwritten letter from Hale himself, and in it, he admitted that he had watched me for decades, guided my career, and ensured that every choice I had made, every hardship I endured, somehow led me to him, that I had been deliberately prepared for this inheritance without ever knowing it, and I realized then that my life, which I had always believed was a series of random struggles, was in fact a carefully orchestrated path. And the most chilling line in the letter suggested that the fortune carried a condition. I was to uncover a truth about my own family that he had hidden, a secret that could either destroy or empower me, and as I looked up at the lawyer, I understood that I had entered a world far larger than my classroom, and the first true test of my courage, and my understanding of my own life, was about to begin. Over the following days, I navigated a surreal haze of shock, disbelief, and cautious excitement, balancing my normal teaching routine with clandestine research into Jonathan Hale's life, his wealth, his mysterious family, and the lingering enigma of why he had chosen me, a stranger, as his heir, and with each revelation, from newspaper clippings to obscure charity reports, I felt the invisible strings of a hidden plan tighten around me, pulling me toward a confrontation I did not yet understand, and one evening, as I sat in my dimly lit apartment studying his life, I discovered a startling coincidence. A photo of Hale at a gala 20 years ago, standing beside a young woman whose face was uncannily familiar. The features hauntingly similar to my own mother's, and suddenly the puzzle pieces began to shift in my mind, suggesting that perhaps this inheritance was not entirely about me, but about a hidden betrayal, a legacy of secrets buried by those I had trusted, and my stomach twisted with the realization that someone close to me might have been concealing truths that would change everything I thought I knew about my family. And as a knock echoed on my door that night, I understood that these secrets were about to make themselves known in ways I could neither predict nor avoid. I opened the door to find my childhood friend, Vanessa, standing there with an envelope trembling in her hands, her eyes darting nervously, and as I motioned for her to enter, I sensed a tension thicker than anything I had ever felt between us, because over the years, Vanessa had been more like a sister than a friend, yet there was something unspoken in her gaze that filled me with a premonition of betrayal, and when she finally handed me the envelope, I saw the documents inside were legal papers, revealing that my late mother had secretly invested in an obscure trust linked to Jonathan Hale, and that the $5 million inheritance was tied directly to a promise my mother had made decades ago, a promise that apparently involved keeping a secret from me, one that, if revealed, could ruin lives and alter relationships that had lasted for generations. And as I stared at the papers, my heart began to pound with confusion, curiosity, and fear, because I realized that the world I thought I knew, my family, my childhood, my hard-fought life as a teacher, was only the surface of a much deeper, darker story, and I knew instinctively that unlocking the next layer of truth would require courage I was not sure I possessed. Determined to understand the full extent of this hidden inheritance, I began tracing Hale's connections, calling obscure law offices, visiting archives, and tracking old business associates, and each step I took seemed to pull me deeper into a labyrinth of wealth, power, and deception that stretched back decades, because the more I learned about Hale's life, the more I realized that his fortune was not just money, but influence, a network of people and secrets that could manipulate governments and families alike, and as I sat in a quiet cafe one rainy afternoon, piecing together his charitable donations, his obscure investments, and his careful attention to certain individuals, including me, I felt a chilling awareness that someone else was watching my investigation, someone who didn't want me to uncover the truth. And when I returned home that evening, I found a note slipped under my door that read only, "Stop looking, or you will regret it," in spidery, familiar handwriting, and I realized then that this inheritance was far more dangerous than I could have imagined, and my quiet, simple life was about to collide violently with secrets that could destroy everything I held dear. Sleep became impossible as I replayed every interaction with friends, neighbors, and colleagues, trying to identify who could have been tipped off about my inheritance, because the warning note suggested intimate knowledge of my movements and investigations, someone who had followed me for years without my awareness. And as I sifted through photographs, letters, and personal files in my small apartment, I noticed subtle signs I had overlooked: a business card left in my mailbox, an email from an anonymous sender that had vanished before I could read it fully, and a faint scratch on the edge of the envelope from Hale's lawyer, as if it had been handled by someone else before reaching me, and each discovery deepened my unease, making me question every relationship I had ever cherished, every trust one had ever given freely. And by midnight, I realized that this inheritance was not just a gift, but a test, and the stakes were higher than I could have imagined, because someone in my life was willing to manipulate, threaten, and deceive to prevent me from claiming the fortune that had been carefully arranged for me over decades, and I knew the next move I made could determine not only my future but my very survival. The second major twist arrived the day I met the lawyer in person at a downtown office lined with floor-to-ceiling windows, sunlight glinting off the polished surfaces, and as he handed me a second envelope, my fingers trembled, because this time, the papers contained not only an amended will, but photographs of Jonathan Hale with a woman I immediately recognized, my own mother, young and vibrant, laughing in a garden I had never seen, and beneath the photographs, a letter in Hale's precise handwriting revealed the shocking truth. My mother had been secretly married to him decades ago, but circumstances forced their separation, and in his will, he had designated me as the sole heir, ensuring that the fortune would bypass countless distant relatives who might have claimed it, and even more startling, Hale had hinted that there were others actively scheming to take the inheritance, including someone very close to me who had lied about my family history, and as I looked up at the lawyer, my stomach turned, because the photograph of my mother holding my baby picture in her arms implied that the inheritance was not just money. It was a key to understanding the hidden history of my family, a history carefully hidden to protect me or control me, and I knew at that moment that the game I had unknowingly been pulled into was far more dangerous than I could ever have anticipated, and that the people I trusted most might be the ones plotting my downfall. I returned home that evening, heart hammering, carrying the photographs and letters like fragile evidence that could shatter my world, and as I set them carefully on the table, I realized that the people I trusted, my friends, my colleagues, even some relatives, might have been watching me for decades without revealing the truth, their silence now carrying the weight of a crime, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I pieced together Hale's life, my mother's hidden past, and the shadow of betrayal that seemed to stretch across generations, because every clue hinted at deliberate manipulation, calculated moves, and secrets so dangerous that they could ruin anyone who got too close. And yet, despite the fear gnawing at my nerves, I felt an undeniable pull toward the truth, toward discovering who had orchestrated my life into this sudden spiral of wealth, deception, and threat. And when I heard a knock at the door, soft but deliberate, I froze, knowing instinctively that the visitor would bring with them the next layer of this intricate, perilous puzzle. And when I opened it, I saw a man I did not recognize, wearing a dark overcoat, his eyes cold and calculating, and in his hand, a briefcase that looked far too heavy to carry alone, and with a voice smoother than silk but sharper than a knife, he said simply, "Ms. Carter, it's time you learned what Jonathan Hale truly wanted for you." The stranger entered, and I could barely breathe, my instincts screaming at me to run, but something compelled me to stay, to hear what he had to say, and as he sat, he opened the briefcase to reveal documents, photographs, and strange symbols that made my pulse spike, because among them were letters written by my mother that revealed not only a secret marriage to Hale but hints at an even older mystery, one that connected my family to powerful people who had interests spanning decades and continents, and with every page he showed, my understanding of reality shifted. My modest life as a schoolteacher, my struggles, my quiet days marking papers, had been a smoke screen, a veil hiding a network of lies and protections built by Hale and my mother to guard me. And when he finally looked up, his eyes piercing mine, he said, "They know you exist now. And they're coming for what's yours." And I understood immediately that this inheritance was not simply wealth, but a weapon, a key, and a target, all rolled into one, and the calmness in his voice made the danger feel sharper, closer, unavoidable, and I knew, as I clasped the edge of the table to steady myself, that my life had transformed from ordinary obscurity to a perilous stage where every choice, every glance, every breath could be manipulated by forces I could neither see nor name, and the realization left me frozen, yet more determined than ever to uncover the full truth, because the inheritance was not just money, it was the key to reclaiming my family's hidden past and surviving a threat I had never imagined. Over the next few days, I delved deeper into Hale's archives, visiting dusty libraries, contacting old acquaintances, and piecing together a network of events that led from my mother's youth to the current day, and everywhere I turned, I found a trail of whispers and half-truths, each clue suggesting that someone close, someone I had trusted implicitly, had been lying to me my entire life, manipulating me for their own gain. And with each revelation, the tension in my chest grew, the fear becoming almost physical, a living weight pressing down on me, because I realized that the closer I got to the final truth, the more danger I invited into my life. And when I returned home one evening, the faint scent of perfume lingered in the hallway, a perfume I recognized from my childhood, and a folded note lay on my counter. "You're getting too close. Stop now, or everything you love will be destroyed." And I understood then that the game I was playing was no longer theoretical, no longer about curiosity or inheritance. It was about survival, and the person who had sent this message knew exactly how to manipulate my emotions, my fears, my love for my family. And as I clutched the note in my hand, heart hammering, I realized that the final reveal was no longer a matter of if, but when, and that the person who would betray me might be closer than I had ever dared imagine. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, late at night, when I cross-referenced Hale's letters with old family photographs and stumbled upon a hidden ledger my mother had kept, full of cryptic names, dates, and codes, and as I deciphered them, the scope of the deception hit me like a storm. The inheritance was not merely financial, but symbolic, meant to reveal the truth about a hidden power struggle within my own bloodline, a struggle that had begun decades before I was born and that involved wealth, influence, and lives manipulated in secret. And suddenly, the pieces fit together in a terrifying pattern, because one of the closest people in my life, the person who had smiled, comforted, and guided me, had been an active participant in concealing this history, and the revelation made my chest tighten, my vision blur with disbelief, and a trembling fury rise inside me, because the betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined, and as I realized that my mother had built a secret chain of protection around me that I had failed to recognize until now, I also understood that the final confrontation, the one that would determine my claim to Hale's inheritance, my understanding of my own history, and my survival, was imminent. And that the choices I made in the next hours would either free me from decades of lies or trap me forever in a web of manipulation and danger. The final twist arrived on a storm-lashed evening, when the lawyer called me to an unmarked building at the edge of the city, and as I entered, lightning illuminating the towering glass walls, I found a room filled with portraits, documents, and people I recognized, faces from my past I thought I knew intimately, standing silently, their eyes sharp and calculating, and in the center, a man stepped forward, revealing himself as my estranged uncle, a man I had believed dead or absent, and he held a letter from Hale addressed to me, which explained that the inheritance had always been a test, a way to reveal the true guardians and betrayers of our family's secrets, and the final revelation stunned me into silence. My mother had orchestrated much of this herself, using Hale's fortune as a tool to protect me, while my uncle had conspired to claim it for himself, manipulating every lie I had ever encountered. And as the storm raged outside, I realized that the person I trusted most, my oldest friend, my family, even the lawyer, were all players in a game that had been decades in motion, and that the inheritance was never about wealth alone, but about revealing the hidden truth of my lineage, exposing the traitors, and giving me the power to rewrite my own destiny. and in that moment, I understood that I had survived the test not because of chance, but because I had learned to see the shadows, to question everything, and to fight for a life, and a truth, that was finally, terrifyingly, mine.